I also want to see responses where platforms are working together, because obviously in my case there is an issue between the YouTube call out and the Twitter weapon. I would personally like to see further action on getting rid of people from these platforms who we know. This man has a brand. Him and other men's rights activists such as Nero have a brand that they use specifically for this abuse, and that brand matters to them because it makes them money, and actually we could really hurt them by damaging their brand by taking it off air.
On the 18th of July 2016, Jess Phillips, MP for Birmingham Yardley, shared her experience of online abuse with an audience of social media executives, NGOs and feminist politicians. During her address, she called for the censorship of men's rights activists on social media platforms, and specifically called for action to be taken against then Brietbart technology editor Milo Yiannopoulos and a prominent YouTuber named Sargon of Akkad, who she alleged was responsible for a campaign of targeted harassment against her. This video looks beyond some of the extraordinary claims about the prevalence and very gendered nature of online abuse that have been made by Phillips and other MPs involved with the Reclaim the Internet campaign, and considers whether they might be motivated by anything other than a concern for the vulnerable children and adults that they claim to speak on behalf of.
Bitch, 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 double cunt, bitch.
If this were another century, I could fuck you until you bled.
Chop up baby parts and drop them in dumpsters. Why don't you think we wouldn't chop you up too and do the same?
I hope they cut off your—
Yes, I hope you get raped, but for legal purposes, I do not intend to rape you myself.
The purpose of this video series has been to document and examine some of the alarming and quite extraordinary headlines about the scale and nature of online abuse that have been made by a number of Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat members of the United Kingdom Parliament, all of whom politically self-identify as feminist. Over the first 4 episodes, I've considered how credible some of these claims actually are, and how well they stand up to close scrutiny in the context of the available empirical evidence. Clearly, abusive behaviour, harassment, stalking, and other criminal activities can and do occur in online environments. Online interactions, particularly on social media, have become an intimate and everyday part of life for millions, and consequently the very modern phenomenon of online abuse is something to be taken very seriously, especially by those with a responsibility to protect children and vulnerable adults. Difficult conversations do need to be had about how best to create safe and inclusive online environments for all, whilst also protecting the potential and freedom that a networked digital world offers. And in that context, the purpose of this series has been to contribute to a difficult and uncomfortable aspect of that conversation concerning the possibility that some people might employ passive-aggressive tactics to exploit the phenomenon and public fear around online abuse and attempt to coercively control the narrative for their own personal or political purposes. The purpose of this series has been to consider some high-profile claims and headlines about online abuse, especially claims about the gendered nature of abuse that myself and many others have increasingly struggled to be entirely convinced by. In the first episode, I considered the quite extraordinary and much repeated claim that one member of parliament in particular has been subjected to torrents of rape and even death threats on a number of occasions, all because of her outspoken support for gender equality. I struggled to find evidence to support these claims, despite the open source nature of the social media platform where most of this abuse is said to have occurred, and despite the fact that she devoted an entire chapter of her own autobiography to her experience of online trolling. This was followed by a review of the surprisingly muddled history of the Reclaim the Internet initiative, led by the UK Labour Party's Yvette Cooper, and an analysis of some of the specific examples of online abuse she has chosen to highlight using this platform. Most particularly a dogpiling incident experienced by science commentator Dr. Emily Grossman after a television appearance where she discussed another incident of dogpiling directed at Nobel Prize winning scientist Tim Hunt. In episode 4, I reviewed the available research about online abuse and highlighted the misleading way that this research has at times been presented, and how quickly some sensational claims from seemingly credible sources such as Amnesty International and even the United Nations fall apart under closer examination, despite having been widely promoted by widely respected media sources such as the BBC and The Guardian. Over these 4 videos, and in additional supporting videos, I believe I have established that all is not necessarily as it may at first glance seem when it comes to some claims, and I emphasise the words some claims, about the nature and frequency of online or virtual abuse. And in the last 2 episodes of this series, I want to reflect on why on earth public servants, members of the press, and even a human rights watchdog like Amnesty International would risk undermining the agency of vulnerable victims of abuse and arguably callously exploit their lived experiences for their own political purposes. In the final episode, I will consider why the Fourth Estate might benefit from promoting an inaccurate and sometimes sensational narrative about online abuse. But in this episode, I want to propose a relatively obvious reason why high-profile champions of the feminist political ideology might be especially invested in promoting such a narrative and using it to seek state interventions to restrict free and unregulated speech in public spaces. And to do this most effectively, I want to begin by travelling back to the year 2012 and consider the impact of a modest online initiative designed to highlight the prevalence of sexual harassment and leering on London's busy public transport system. In April 2012, Cambridge graduate and former actor Laura Bates started a website and associated Twitter feed called the Everyday Sexism Project. The aim of this project was to capture and catalogue examples of sexism experienced by people on a day-to-day basis in modern Britain. Bates believed that the relative assumption that women had achieved equality in developed Western countries like the UK made it difficult for women like her to complain about what she called the niggling, small, so used to it you almost just accept it type of sexism that they encounter in their everyday life. And what made her approach relatively unique was that she encouraged women to contact her and express their personal frustrations and perceptions about sexism without judgment, be it an outrageously offensive incident of blatant sex discrimination, or something so niggling, minor or normalised that ordinarily they would feel unable to protest or confess their annoyance. Her initial hope for the project was to gather around 100 stories, capturing a patchwork of different types of examples of sexism experienced by ordinary people in ordinary places. But Bates quickly found her project elevated on the crest of a wave of a quickly growing and global community of self-identifying feminists who were increasingly using the internet to connect with each other, share their ideas, their ideology, and increasingly through targeted digital activism, or clicktivism, lobby for and demand the sort of change in the world that they wanted to see. Within 2 short years, Bates and her team of volunteers had collected more than 60,000 stories, extended the project to over 20 different countries, transforming it into a highly effective and influential campaigning platform. As the main curator and gatekeeper of these stories, Bates herself quickly became a go-to authority for comments in the British media and beyond on an ever-widening range of subjects. She found herself advising transport police on how their officers should respond to complaints of unwanted sexual behaviour, working with trade unions on promoting safe working environments, speaking at the UN about women's disadvantages, and assisting the Council of Europe to develop guidelines on the portrayal of women in the media. Within 2 years of launching her modest project, she had secured a lucrative book deal with publishing giant Simon & Schuster, a weekly column in The Guardian, and in 2014 she became the youngest ever entry in BBC Women's Hour Power List, celebrating the 10 most influential women in the UK. Bates had established herself as a key influencer in the vanguard of a resurgence in feminism facilitated and emboldened by options made possible by social media and the World Wide Web, a movement that would come to be defined as the 4th major wave in collective feminist activism.
The first wave was the suffragist, the second wave was the women's liberation movement of the 1970s, the third wave was kicked off by the Anita Hill hearings in the Year of the Woman in the early 1990s. We are now in the 4th wave, and that we are marked by being a generation who does much of our activism online with offline components, that we are radicalized in online feminist spaces. Blogs are my generation's form of consciousness raising group. You don't need to be in a women's studies class. You don't need to be able to have a car or childcare to go to a consciousness raising group. You can get on your computer and speak out and be part of the conversation. One of the reasons that the 4th wave is able to and willing to and committed to including all experiences is that the barriers to access to feminist conversations are much lower now. You can get on your computer and speak out and be part of the conversation. For me, the difference between the 3rd wave and the 4th wave, so the 3rd wave was very focused on telling individual stories and talking about their personal way of living feminism, which is important. The personal is political. That's the slogan of the feminist movement. But my generation is, I think, naturally a little bit more collective in our activism, because we are in these spaces all of the time where people are challenging you, adding things to your opinion. Anyone can go out, if they don't agree with your blog, they can go out and start their own feminist blog. So it seems that there's a commitment to collective activism via necessity.
In many respects, Laura Bates is an important figure when considering both positive and negative aspects of contemporary trends in advocacy and activism concerning equality and human rights for all. But she's also simply one of many competing media-savvy activists associated with the resurgence of a political movement that had been relatively dormant for 2 decades, and the rapid growth of a digital movement that to a large extent would become defined by the public-shaming call-out culture championed by initiatives like the Everyday Sexism Project. Campaigners who, in the years that followed, would come to have a considerable influence and even veto over an ever-expanding sphere of public life. Campaigners who somehow seemed to be able to see sexism everywhere they looked, and most particularly everywhere they pointed.
There's actually proof that this is happening, that women, do feel the cold more than men, and that the AC in offices is normally regulated more for a male's temperature than a woman's.
No, I know I experience the same, because what I've often found is you go in on a really hot summer's day, you're wearing summer clothes, you go into an office and it's absolutely freezing. I think even for some men it must be too cold. I don't understand why air conditioning is often so cold. So what you have to do is then take a jumper in with you and put that jumper on in order to be able to function.
Yeah. honestly, I think so many women listening now are going to just be nodding their heads thinking, yes, that is exactly my reality. You know, we joke at work that we actually can't dress fashionably anymore for summer because you actually just can't go in sandals. You can't go in a summer dress because you're going to have to put on the jumper or the emergency cardigan. So, yeah, it is quite frustrating, especially when you then go out on your lunch break or your commute home and you're absolutely boiling outside. And I think there is a bit of a problem when it's warmer outside than it is inside your office.
So what's the solution then? Because we can't have men overheating in the offices, can we?
You know what, maybe there can be more flexibility with men not having to wear suits in some offices and they can come in T-shirts or whatever they need to be the right temperature.
Because, like, when you start learning about systems, everything is sexist, everything is racist, everything is homophobic, and you have to point it all out.
Everything is sexist, everything's offensive to people like me. Let's go through the checklist, it's all misogyny. Everything is sexist when you break the dead. Doesn't matter how absurd or desperate, forget about merits. We're oppressed every day, what you say, it's a white supremacy. Everything is sexist, everything's a gender conspiracy. Everything is sexist, it's the patriarchy. Everything is sexist, everything's a part of the patriarchy. Everything is sexist, it's all misogyny.
For a brief moment between 2013 and 2014, a movement that has struggled with significant image problems for most of its existence almost seemed to have somehow become an inevitable and entirely natural part of early 21st century zeitgeist. For a brief moment, feminism seemed fashionable, pervasively popular even. But as Time magazine discovered at the end of the year when they asked their readers what word they would like to assign to the dustbin of history, even at its recent peak, feminism still had a massive image problem. A fact that the not exactly impartial Fawcett Society even begrudgingly acknowledged the following year when it revealed that their largest ever survey of women and men's attitudes, conducted at the very height of the fourth wave resurgence, found that only 7% of people across the UK identified themselves as feminist. To put that into context, that's 27% fewer people than believe in ghosts, and 28% fewer people than believe in angels. And almost exactly the same number of people in the UK, who according to Fawcett's same poll, don't support or believe in equality between men and women. That other 7% includes almost as many women as men. But for the sake of simplistic convenience and gendered stereotyping, we will call them male supremacists. Numerous research projects, including Fawcett's own, show that the vast majority of the general public do generally agree with the general messages that feminists generally appear to champion, and that they certainly agree with the simple egalitarian principle of equality and fairness for all. But interestingly, in 2014, a major psychological study into support for social justice causes also reported that people already inclined to favour feminist causes were actually less likely to do so after coming into direct contact with actual people self-identifying as feminist activists. In other words, the more they were to learn about what actual feminists actually think, and how they can sometimes stereotypically behave, the less inclined they were to support their movement. Feminism has of course traditionally been understood to be most simply a movement for female equality. But the further and wider this confident new generation of assertive networked feminists have promoted their message via social media, the more they find themselves encountering criticism, pushback, and accusations of promoting rhetoric that often feels a little petty, mean-spirited, vindictive, exclusive, exclusionary, censorish, and more than a little man-hatey. And as they push their agenda into new online spaces, increasingly and inevitably people began to push back. A pushback that presents two very distinct problems for feminism in the digital age. The first is that by now almost anyone, anywhere, can get access to a computer, speak out and become part of a public conversation. The barriers to access to public debates and conversations about social justice have become much lower, so much so in fact that for a short moment in history, the opportunity to comment was even free and open to anyone below the line in the likes of the Guardian newspaper. And while most people just want to focus on telling individual stories and talking to people about shared interests and experiences, increasingly many people spending time online in shared public spaces became confronted by aspects of feminism that they found they didn't necessarily agree with. And some of them began to start blogs, or Twitter feeds, or YouTube channels, uniting in a commitment to collective activism that was often born out of a feeling of urgent necessity. And the emboldened ranks of networked sisterhoods came to discover that the Internet of Ideas was not their own to exclusively utilise, as analysis, criticism and satire of feminist activist articles and videos began to appear in significant number, often generating more interest than the original works themselves. By way of example, here are some brief thoughts from a grown man masquerading as a cartoon bear about a peer-reviewed article that was genuinely published in a social science journal in May 2017.
Anatomical penises may exist, but as pre-operative transgendered women also have anatomical penises, the penis vis-a-vis maleness is an incoherent construct. We argue that the conceptual penis is better understood not as an anatomical organ but as a social construct isomorphic to performative toxic masculinity.
Well, I think that was pretty straightforward. Everyone understands that. Moving along.
The conceptual penis is the operative representation of the penis in society as it obtains via a variety of performative acts and statements related to and concerning gender. Conceptualization is the best way to understand the penis, as the notion of penis as a male anatomical organ suffers typical androcentric and meta-scientific limitations and errors, as it is both overly reductive, in failing to represent the full reality of penis-bearing human experiences, and incoherent, as the penis itself has little or nothing to do with gender.
Nah, I'm only joking. In fact, if you understood any of that, then you are full of shit. And I'm going to tell you why.
But sadly, the more these people mocked and pushed back from feminist hegemony, the more they began to be accused of misogyny or trolling, harassment or hate speech, and the more that politicians and social media service providers began to be lobbied by influential and well-resourced specialist lobby groups to reclaim the internet from a troubling infestation of deplorables and garbage humans.
There's too many dicks on the dance floor!
Too many dicks on the dance floor. Too many dicks on the dance floor.
Too many dicks.
2014's Gamergate controversy exposed this fault line to a larger audience. Centered on issues of sexism and progressivism in video game culture, it is a tale of two very different truths, depending on who you believe. The Guardian newspaper's pioneering network feminists, Jessica Valenti, described Gamergate as a last gasp at cultural dominance by angry white men, while Milo Yiannopoulos, who was one of the first journalists to actually cover it, calls it the first great stand against the ever-emerging totalitarianism and intolerance towards diversity from the progressive line, which in a post-Brexit and Trump era feels more like a turning point. Whether you believe that Gamergate was a consumer reaction to compelled language codes, tone policing and public shaming campaigns led by people with an innate sense of fair play, or whether you believe it can be defined as a harassment campaign by women-hating angry young white men, will largely depend on what media you consume and how much you've looked into the truth of the matter for yourself. I'm not a gamer, so I can't speak definitively, and certainly no matter how thin you slice a thing, there will always be two sides. But that said, the fact that one side has subsequently developed into a movement primarily concerned with free speech is clearly significant. Also significant is the fact that the two people that Jess Phillips was so especially concerned with silencing at the start of this video emerged from that side of Gamergate. By then, Carl Benjamin and Milo Yiannopoulos had also both developed quite a reputation for intelligently and very effectively critiquing fourth wave feminist dogma. In Yiannopoulos' case, partly through a series of television debates later watched by millions on YouTube, where his opponents clearly struggled with his refreshingly plain speaking and unapologetic tone.
We hear this a lot from scientists, you hear a lot in particular from female scientists, but the fact is that there is some reason to suppose that there is an advantage to being a man in certain subjects. There's reason to suppose that gender essentialism, biological determinism, whatever you want to call it, the fact that there are male brains and female brains, may indeed have some basis in science. Now, this is sort of thrown out of the window completely by feminists and female academics who just refuse to accept that there's any reason whatsoever why there might be a gender imbalance. Two things on that. One, actually the science is very much still out on that. And two, if you look at equality in society, if you look, for example, at Bangladesh versus Norway, what you notice is the number of women in science and technology subjects actually goes down as societies get more equal, because women simply don't make the same choices that female academics and feminists would like them to. Women actually don't want to go into the sciences on the whole, and when they have every option available to them, they tend to choose not to.
Right. These figures,
you must understand.
These figures are... You're going to excuse me mansplaining, aren't you?
No,
these figures come from averages across society. They don't take into account the different life choices that women make. The reality is that women do prefer a more balanced life. When they go to work, even if they don't have babies, they take longer holidays. They tend to take more holidays. And the reason that you know, they are paid more, up to about 30, 35, 39, depending on whose figures you believe. The reason that flips
only
at the
between
end,
30 and 39.
The reason, no, that's actually not true. The reason that the figures flip after that age is because women make different life choices.
Right.
And if you take those life choices into account, no serious economist believes this stuff. It's repeated by politicians right up to President Obama, but no serious economist takes the wage gap seriously.
Is subjected to abuse that is saddening them and that is affecting them quite deeply. What advice would you give?
Toughen up. Toughen up. The majority of what's called abuse, harassment and trolling is ridicule. Sometimes it's strong ridicule. It's criticism. Sometimes it's strong criticism. But that's what the internet's for. And, you know, we're going to miss out on some really important, essential conversations if we don't allow people to communicate in the way that they want to.
Women agree with me. I mean, 7% of British women describe themselves as feminists. Just 7. It's only journalists who are still feminists.
Feminism is actually about...
Feminism about equality, of course. You know, they say one thing...
You don't believe that. You're redefining it.
Well, no, they say one thing and they behave very differently. Feminists like to say, when they're on the defensive, oh, don't you believe in equal rights? But the way they actually behave is nasty, vindictive,
Do you believe in equality for women? Do you believe in equality for women?
Any normal person does. There's an enormous problem, I read about this last year, I call it the sexist, of men checking out of society, checking out of relationships, giving up on women, giving up on careers. They don't bother to go to university anymore. Now more women go to university, women get higher grades at university, more women graduate from university. Yep. All of the traditional imbalances between men and women have flipped, and very recently.
No, that's
and when
incorrect,
young
because
men,
when you go
may I be allowed
further
to
in the
finish?
business,
Sorry,
that's
I'm talking
not
about men, darling.
And you call it darling? And now you think it's funny. You're sitting there laughing. This is exactly the problem. It's not funny. It's institutional sexism. And you're just sitting here doing it flagrantly and without even apologising.
Yiannopoulos is undoubtedly a controversial and provocative character. His stratospheric rise from daytime spots on British TV to sold-out college tours, lucrative book deals, and a front-row seat at Trump's election victory certainly made him many enemies in the progressive left.
Where are you, CNN? CNN journalists! Hello, any CNN journalists? Any CNN journalists? Any... Oh, no, wait, you've all gone home because you're fucking liars and frauds. Where is the mainstream media right now? Look at this! Look at these empty roads! Look at it! Look! Turn the camera around. This is the media covering the Trump victory party. This is what the media looks like. America, this should tell you something. What it tells you is that these people don't really want to tell you what's happening. They don't really want to. Once the narrative falls apart, once the narrative is self-destructs under the reality of a Trump victory, They just leave. They just leave. So whatever they tell you tomorrow, however they explain this victory, whatever they tell you led to this victory, they have no clue. They don't know. And this is why. This is why.
Look at this.
Because they're
the
not
sick media right now, they're gone. They're left.
Not here.
This is the Titanic.
They're not here.
They left. They're the first ones on the lifeboats.
The only influential, now mainstream publication that's here, that's reporting honestly, that has dozens of people on the floor, Brietbart News.
And some of his most vocal critics have been fourth wave feminists, for at least one very obvious reason.
Hi, first of all I'd like to say thank you because I used to be a huge feminist and an SJW, and listening to you speak like completely flipped my views, and now...
Thank you.
And my question is, I'm 14 and I was wondering how I could help my peers and people my age get interested in politics.
His critics frequently persuade the possibility that he appears to support many of the things that they claim to hate the most. He appears to be a racist, a misogynist, and an Islamophobe. His provocative statements and headlines give him the appearance of transphobia or of being a leading figure in the emerging alt-right. Such appearances were even caricatured in an episode of the CBS political drama The Good Fight, where a flamboyant, amusing, and extremely flawed character clearly based on him is ultimately exposed as a racist trickster plotting cyber terrorism and coordinating online hate campaigns behind the curtain. But as much as his detractors would like to believe that the fictional character of Felix Staples bears more than a surface level resemblance to Milo, they have to date offered little, if any, substantive evidence to support these allegations. But like mud, smearing labels do have a tendency of sticking if you throw them often enough. And a clearly coordinated press campaign on the eve of his appearance at the influential Conservative Political Action Conference certainly slowed his ascent after it was alleged that he had appeared to have made statements in support of paedophilia. As with all the other allegations, Yiannopoulos has rigorously denied this and pointed out that they are based on statements where he talked about his experiences of sexual abuse as a child. But it is yet another label frequently projected onto his persona that is particularly relevant to this particular analysis, and which brings us to the second and much bigger challenge for feminism in this networked digital age.
Equal protection under the law is great, but doesn't that mean for both sexes?
Oh my God, you hate women! Misogyny! Rape! Sexual harassment! Call the fuck police!
Journalists like Milo Yiannopoulos clearly damage feminism's brand by asking challenging questions and ridiculing its more eccentric and contradictory behaviours. But there is one thing that has the potential to damage the undisputed market leader in the movement for gender equality, even more than robust scrutiny and satire. And that thing is, of course, competition.
Don't listen to men's rights activists if you want to know what they have to say.
Don't listen to men's rights activists if you want to know what they have to say.
Curiously enough, Yiannopoulos was permanently suspended from Twitter within 24 hours of Jess Phillips's call to have him taken off air. In my humble subjective opinion, this just happens to be one of life's strange coincidences. But something certainly less coincidental is the fact that Phillips has repeatedly described both Yiannopoulos and Carl Benjamin as men's rights activists, despite the fact that anyone familiar with their content would tell you that they're clearly not. Like most of the respondents to Fawcett's survey about attitudes towards men and women, they have both expressed their support for equality of opportunity for men and women, which along with their unapologetic critique of feminist ideology may genuinely be enough for an ideologue like Phillips to sincerely perceive them as men's rights activists. But then again, the possibility that anyone, or indeed everyone in support of equality of opportunity, might by extension support a movement in support of rights for men, is certainly a strong motive to ruthlessly and consciously want to smear and silence such a clear and present danger to a monopoly that has served people like Phillips so very well. Because the most common and most valid criticism about the current market leader in the equality for all economy is that they have zero to little concern for half of the current market. Something which Jess Phillips illustrated all too well when she openly laughed in Parliament at the very notion of a discussion about male inequalities, and then even had the arrogance to try and shut it down, or at the very least postpone it for a few decades.
I don't care about men's issues, it's that I'm hoping for parity myself.
Hear, hear.
I absolutely care about men's issues. And when I've got parity, and when women in these buildings have parity, you can have your debate.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, if I can just make the point,
and that will take an awfully long time.
I'm not requesting a debate on representation within the House of Commons. I'm asking for debates on men's issues, and the list of issues I gave earlier, I would like to think people can recognise are genuine issues and actually are very, very rarely debated in the House of Commons.
As evidenced on a daily basis by powerful platforms like the Everyday Sexism Project, apart from promoting their appearance as perpetrators and of being a large part of the problem, fourth wave feminists have very little interest in men and boys at all. Perhaps surprisingly, Laura Bates claims that her, perhaps ironically titled project, does actively document and share the experiences of everyday sexism experienced by everyday men. You could be forgiven for not knowing this if you follow her Twitter feed, but she is at least correct in the sense that one chapter of her 400-page best-selling book about sexism does indeed include examples of everyday sexism experienced by approximately 49% of the people in her world. But even then, her examples are filtered through a feminist gaze, prepared to witness a necessarily narrow list that helpfully serve the so-called sisterhood's worldview of embracing examples like fathers being turned down for parental leave and male nurses being ridiculed by their boorish macho peers. And yet, predictably, the feminist who built her career and a not insignificant fortune on the niggling, small, so used to it you almost just accept it types of sexism.
Pushy, stubborn, pushy, stubborn, bossy, pushy, stubborn, pushy, bossy.
When I was 8, I was confused being called bossy because I wanted to direct the plays that we would put on for our parents.
Fuck that sexist shit!
Has yet to find time for talk of imbalanced family court outcomes, parental alienation, paternity frauds, false rape allegations, direct discrimination in domestic abuse and sexual violence services, male genital mutilation, male health outcomes, media misandry, or even the underrepresentation of boys in STEM. That's STEM with 2 M's, just in case you're wondering. One of the most obvious reasons Phillips may have been so concerned with silencing someone like Milo Yiannopoulos is because his cult of celebrity happened to have a vital role to play in the crowdfunding appeal for a modest, low-budget film by an award-winning feminist documentary director about the men's movement. For the uninitiated, grants and funding that had been readily available for her previous projects very quickly dried up when it became clear that Cassie J intended to be fair-minded and make a film that moved beyond the feminist lens. Within days of Yiannopoulos writing an article about her situation, over 1,000 funders had stepped forward and the budget for Jay's film, The Red Pill, had been secured. And despite constant attempts to smear both her and her film, millions of people have subsequently been given an insight into a movement many feminists try to label as male supremacists. and an insight into why, although she continues to passionately support equality of opportunity for all, much like men's rights activists, these days Cassie J identifies as a non-feminist. Is it any wonder that people like Bates or Phillips might want to silence or even smear people like J and Yiannopoulos? In my own humble and very subjective opinion, the very silly chain of events that led to all those remarkable fake news headlines for 3 years running now could very easily have been avoided if Jess Phillips had simply paid a bit more attention to the code of conduct for members of parliament. Not only might it have occurred to her that her new role involves a specific duty to uphold the discrimination laws, including discrimination on grounds of sex, and given that literally only months earlier she had been working as a business development manager for one of the market brand leaders in the provision of support services to victims of domestic violence, who despite getting millions from the taxpayer every year, quite literally won't have a man about the place.
It happens to men too, you know. It
happens to men.
Do you want a point? It happens to men as well. Oh, yeah, okay.
Presumably, she should have declared a conflict of interest. She'd probably say I was victim blaming, while more experienced public servants might simply consider it to be a matter of good governance. In truth, given their current position as market leaders and gatekeepers of equality, it's fairly obvious why feminists would want to shut down certain types of speech and speakers, even if they have to stretch the truth a little in the interest of maintaining their dominance in the market.
When I now go on YouTube, I have a series of recommended videos promoted to me. Included in that are a series of other, frankly, pretty vile videos about white genocide, about various ones. Why am I getting recommendations from YouTube for some pretty horrible organisations? So it's not simply that you haven't removed it and that you're making it hard or not hard for me to search for, you're actually actively recommending it to me. You are actively recommending what is effectively racist material into people's timelines. What is it that we have to do to get you to take it down?
But that still doesn't explain why it is that so many in the mainstream media seem so prepared to play along. In the final episode of this series, I will consider why that might be. But for now, I want to finish with a thought about an episode of another recent American television drama. One set in a dystopian future where totalitarianism and theocracy reign supreme, and both technology and language are used as an oppressive force against the masses. It's an episode from Hulu's award-winning Handmaid's Tale, a series which has become a firm favourite with feminist fan bases, presumably because it offers a genuinely disturbing and brutal vision of actual male supremacy. I'd have thought that anyone believing that they are currently living in an oppressive patriarchy might prefer to suspend their imagination in other ways, but nevertheless, it is my sincere hope that feminists like Jess Phillips have been paying close attention to this cautionary tale, especially during episode 6, entitled A Woman's Place. Because in the story, A Woman's Place is also the title of a book that becomes the manifesto and template for the patriarchal Republic of Gilead, and a world where patriarchy really does hurt most men too. Perhaps not as much as the woman, most especially the on-woman, but it's certainly not a future that I want to visit anytime soon. Anyway, the sting in the tail is that the template for that society was actually written by a woman, an extreme ideologue and cultural activist, prepared to smear her enemies, plot false flags and staged attacks in order to bring about her utopian vision. A vision she symbolically ends up throwing in the bin at the end of the episode, after it transpires that she is denied a place at the top table of the New World Order she helped to create. The moral of the story is, of course, to be careful what you wish for, because you may not get exactly what you wish. Something which rings true in the aftermath of the so-called YouTube adpocalypse, that MPs like Jess Phillips and Yvette Cooper lobbied hard to help create, and helped to hit a lot of people exactly where it hurts.
I needed to make this. This is about something that YouTube has put in place. We don't really know, I think, how long it's been there, but it's something that people are just starting to realise the extent of it, particularly in regards to LGBT related content, and that is the restricted viewing mode. This is a mode which YouTube itself explains is for families and for children, and it is filtering out a hell of a lot of LGBT content. I've had around 40 videos taken off in restricted mode, so you can't see them if you're in restricted mode. Callum has had every single video on his channel bar one taken off. Neon Fiona has had all of her things to do with her having a girlfriend taken off, but not her thing to do with having a boyfriend. So this is something that no one's really sure how it's working, but we know that it has some kind of targeted effect for LGBT individuals, whether that is with kind of automatic tagging of content that they don't think is appropriate. But I think it's really important to look at why LGBT content has been deemed as inappropriate. This is something which goes far beyond just a mistake that YouTube might have made that they're going to draw attention to and fix later. This is something that's getting me really, really angry, and I've made some videos recently about LGBT kids content, and it all comes back to this particular insidious idea which has been with us for so long as part of our history. Look at our history, look at Anita Bryant, look at Section 28. The sexualization of queer and trans people is still rampant. This kind of insidious poison which makes us seem inappropriate is still around, it's still having an effect. YouTube is one of the only places that queer and trans youth, gay youth, bisexual youth, pansexual youth, asexual youth, any of these kids have a way into community, have a way into knowledge, have a way into feeling like they aren't alone. I've literally just finished presenting a documentary on this. Kids are scared, kids are alone, and kids are dying, and this is not how you help them.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.